Welcome to episode 105 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Have you ever had a setback in life? I'm sure we all have. Question is, how did you handle it? Did you grin and bear it, trying harder next time? Or forging your way through using lies and deception so no one would know of your shortcomings? As crazy as it may seem, many resort to the latter when faced with such a dilemma. Our guest today is Tracy Badua, author of This Is Not a Personal Statement. Now, it's a work of fiction, but it was inspired by actual events. Tracy's book actually highlights a common problem when it comes to students facing pressures and stress in academics. And today, she's going to join us to talk more about that. Tracy, welcome to Anchored in Education.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
We're excited. We're excited to have you today, especially this topic. Really kind of a fun topic, and one that, you know what, I'm going to give it away if I just keep going. So let me back up. So I always begin each episode asking guests how they became anchored in education. And while you don't have a background in education, you do have extensive experience with reading and writing, as well as interpreting complex legal briefs as a lawyer. And then I believe I have read where you were influenced to the written word by your great-grandfather, who was a school teacher. So can you give us a little insight into your professional background, and especially what does being an author mean to you?
Of course. Yeah, with my family, both my great-grandfather and my grandmother were actually both educators. So I got that in very early. My grandmother was actually the kind of person who growing up, she would give us worksheets in the summer to, practice math. And I knew what verbs were just way earlier than some of my classmates. That was just kind of the person that she was. That's how important learning is to her.
Sure.
So, as you mentioned, I'm not an educator, but I am a lawyer, and I definitely grew up reading. I went to the library all the time with my parents. I read all of the books I wanted from there, so they started taking me to a different library. And eventually I started getting this idea of like, hey, maybe I can write these. Those early works, though, it's me writing about my stuffed animals getting haircuts. It wasn't anything. It wasn't anything that exciting, but it kind of got the creative juices flowing, and It eventually kind of worked its way. Throw in, as you get older, of course, you throw in the practicality of, healthcare and a full-time job. And that love of the written word really became, let me see if I can make my way as a lawyer. And I practice today, but being an author, writing fiction is a way for me to get back to that creative side. And it's using all those skills that I've developed over the years, like you said, with the analysis. And what was really important is writing for young readers is you take these big complex ideas and distill it down to something a little bit more readable and relatable, which has really come in handy not only as a lawyer, but as, again, a children's author.
Oh, yeah.
But it's a lot. I did take a couple of windy roads to get to where I am, and I'm doing too much, so I've heard.
Well, but we all do what works best for us, and it's a great segue into our conversation. But I do want to back up just in hearing what you said, and that you said you're not an educator, but I would argue that in fact you are, because you're educating people on the law whenever you're practicing as a lawyer. You're educating people on just when we get into this book that we're talking about today. I mean, you're the the education takeaways from this, I think, are huge. And then you shared that you also have a small toddler. And so the best kind of educator for me has been whenever I have been able to welcome my two children and introduce them into the world and the different things. So definitely you are an educator. You are anchored in education. And that is why we're having this conversation today about your book called This Is Not a Personal Statement. Now, it's a fiction book, but it was inspired by actual events. And I think something we need to realize, though, is that events like this and similar to this, I think they really happen more routinely than we think. And so maybe before we continue on in our conversation, you can share more about This Is Not a Personal Statement.
Yes. So This Is Not a Personal Statement is a contemporary young adult novel. It's about a girl. The main character's name is Perla. She has all these lofty dreams of going to her dream school and then going to med school and then joining her mom's skincare practice. And there's so much pressure for her to be, perfect and do all of these things glowingly and be able to brag to everyone about how great she is. But of course, she doesn't get into her dream college. And she decides, instead of coming clean to her parents, she decides to fake her own acceptance letter, which leads to a very stressful series of events where she moves onto campus and, crashes courses, kind of sneaks around in the dorms and even makes a couple of friends, all with this idea that she's going to reapply and get in spring semester, and then nobody will know. She'll just go on and live her life.
I know, and what a roller coaster it takes us on. So many who have read this book mention a connection or understanding into Perla's motivations. In fact, I felt the same way because there's nothing like being met with letdown, and you don't want to share that with others because, I don't know. Well, I've had those same extremes, and I feel I've faced temptations to hide the truth from my imperfections. I really think that's the thing. We try to hide those imperfections. And I wonder, can we talk a minute why we do this as humans? And if you believe it stems from pressures society or cultures place upon us?
I really did a lot of thinking on this as I was writing the book, because of course, just really generally, no one wants to be the person who messes up. And I think it's amplified these days, especially in, kind of the social media age where everything is highly publicized and highly curated. You only see the best of everyone. And even when it's like, oh, I just got out of bed and this is how I look, it's like the best that they've ever looked getting out of bed. Their hair's all done and they still look fantastic. So it's interesting that the pressure to constantly look like you're, doing great, like you're perfect is just everywhere. And one of the things I explore in this book is, at least in the Filipino culture, Perla is Filipino, there's this concept of utang ng loob, which is really, distilling it down, it's a debt of the soul is, I think, the very loose translation of it. But it's this idea that everyone, your family and everyone around you has done so much for you to succeed, essentially, that you kind of owe them that success. So that's one of the things that Perla in the book that she has internalized, and a lot of the pressure to go to this elite school and be a doctor and be perfect, a lot of this comes from herself.
Okay.
So it's really interesting. I had to work through a lot of stuff on my own to work it into the character, but just the mass amount of pressure that we put on, for the book, young people who are still figuring things out and should still be able to make mistakes, the immense amount of pressure we put on them to just, follow a straight line and do everything right.
And in hearing you talk about that, because of course the book focuses on Perla, who is a teenager, but in looking looking at myself, or, you looking at yourself, in like motherhood, when you look out onto, say, social media, you see all of these parents, mothers, fathers doing like above and beyond. And I know it does for me, but I'm wondering for you, does it ever question like, oh, am I enough for my child? Am I doing it? Like, I mean, are the pressures still there? Do you see as adults as well?
I mean, absolutely. As I mentioned very early on in our conversation, like I feel like I'm doing too much,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop anytime soon. My one of the kind of stronger feelings I had of like, oh my gosh, am I doing enough in the right places? Is so I have a toddler, and her at her daycare they had a Valentine's Day celebration. And so I slapped a sticker on a couple of Valentines and sent them out into the world. And then she came back with this bag, and one of the other parents had created this beautiful photoshopped Valentine with their kid's face on it, and this wonderful like paper bag that had all these goodies. And I was like, oh my goodness. I feel like the pressure never leaves. It just like it shifts in different ways. Like, oh, I don't have to take finals, but now I have to
Yeah.
celebrate holidays, or my kid's gonna come home and think I didn't spend enough time on Pinterest.
Yeah. Been there, done that as a parent, but then also being an educator in a first grade, third grade classroom at different times, just to see some of the things that kids brought in. Like, I mean, it's great that your parents had the time to build robots out of candy, but like, like I don't even know that we could find the hot glue gun in my house. So going back to your book, Tracy, it's not too far out there if we consider some other similar events that have transpired, maybe most recently and definitely most high profile, being a college admission scandal in 2019. What do you believe we can do as adults to help our students and our children not feel unnecessary pressure while at the same time accepting that it is okay for our kids to experience struggles and disappointments?
I struggled with this, as I mentioned, kind of with my own kids too. And I think part of what I had in the back of my mind when I was writing this book is I want to make sure that like all this pressure to be a certain way and do certain things, I want to make sure that I don't put that on them in a kind of a toxic way. And I wrote it into the acknowledgments. I think I have something like, if I ever do something like this to you, just, throw this book right back at me.
Yeah.
Because I can already, like, it's obviously generations worth of wanting to succeed and what a success looks like. So I can already see that kind of coming into my my tactics as a mother. And I was like, oh, I need to reel it in a little bit and not put that on to the next generation. But I think what I'm trying to remember as, a mom and as a person is that there's a value in trying. And I have so many rejections. I graduated law school in like 2010 when everything was going south. So like I know how many no's you can get from employers and from everywhere. So I also know how much growth a no can cause. Like you can. It's one thing to like always win and be like, yes, this is fantastic, I'm wonderful. But a no really makes you sometimes work harder. After you pick yourself up off the floor, it sometimes makes you work harder. But I think generally a lot of it is undoing our own perceptions of what are, elite schools and do we have to go to them, or what are acceptable professions and why do we term them like that? And really kind of expose ourselves and our kids to, the whole breadth of experience out there in terms of education professions, so they don't feel like there's a right or wrong. And one thing, again, I'm trying to remember is like, it's the thing about my kids' lives is that it has nothing to do with me.
Right.
It's like, it's not about me probably, but their choice of school, their choice of friends and everything, it's not going to be something that I have absolute control over. So I need to just learn to guide them to what will serve them best. But I say all of that with the preface of ask me again in a few years when my kids are making their own decisions. Like I could just completely flip flop on this.
Absolutely. Well, we've heard it here first. Tracy's going to come back in a couple of years, and we're going to replay some of this and see that she's stuck to it. Hey, Tracy, before we go, now
I'll be like, they're total monsters. I have to make all the decisions. They're ruining their lives.
I'll be the one that. It was the way you edited this episode. I never said that. Hey, before we go. You've given us kind of what some of the takeaways are, but let's just say that someone has listened to this podcast and they're like, you know what, I need to go pick up This Is Not a Personal Statement, maybe for themselves. Maybe they know somebody that's struggling with along these same things we've done. What would you hope the underlying message would be the takeaway from the reading experience?
So, of course, the lawyer in me says the main message is please don't commit fraud. But, the writer in me is, I think one of the things I was really trying to get through in the book was, we all need to cut ourselves a little slack here and there.
Mm-hmm.
I heard from a few readers who, for better or for worse, they saw themselves in the book of like, oh my gosh, I went to a high pressure academic, like I was in a high pressure school and then my parents did this and then my family does this. And it's wonderful to hear from readers, but it's also a little heartbreaking because like the nature of the book is like, oh, this is not as great as it seems. And I think all of us want a little permission to, ease up a little. So this is your assurance that the world will not fall apart if we don't do everything. Like you can cut yourself some slack. This is the permission.
Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the day, I think we, no one's perfect, which is basically the message of the book. Because of course, she goes by her friends or her colleague or her classmates call her Perfect Perla. Mm-hmm. No one's perfect and it's okay to mess up and to be upset about it, of course. But there's always going to be a path forward, even if it's not the one that you originally envisioned.
Absolutely. And I think legally you're bound to have the first part that don't commit fraud. Number one, first and foremost, get it. All right.
I've started signing books that way. I'll, do my nice little author signature and then a little disclaimer of don't do fraud.
Don't do fraud. I love it. We need a sticker. The book is This Is Not a Personal Statement, and I'm going to put a link to it on today's episode page so everybody can go out and pick up their copy today. Tracy, thank you so much for joining us on Anchored in Education.
Thank you again for having me.
You can read more about Tracy on today's episode page. Simply head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on the podcast tab at top. You will also find a link to all of Tracy's social media, as well as a link to get you your copy of her book, This Is Not a Personal Statement, today. And don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. While Tracy's book is for the young adult, us old adults could greatly benefit from the reminder it serves. I have faced many instances of letdowns over the course of many years. I've not gotten jobs where I felt I was the best candidate and a sure shoo-in. I've not gotten into programs and classes, even when I felt I've made a great case for myself. Even recently, I've had articles and manuscripts not accepted when I believe the content is relevant and much needed. It's tough to face challenges, friends, and even family when talking about these failures. I often want to disguise them and dress them up not as failures, but successes that look different. And while I might fool others, I can't fool myself. And much like Perla, my attempts at disguising my failures only leads to more work for me, and more stress, and more unhappiness. We must work at accepting letdowns for what they are, opportunities for growth and improvement. We need to let our students know this is how we feel too. Growth, improvement, and unconditional support for everyone is one of the best ways for us all to remain anchored in education.